go. Okay, so we are recording, and give me one more second. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. I don't think we can go live on Facebook. It only says YouTube, so I think this is fine. I'll just post the video afterwards on our Facebook.
Good. Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay, guys. So everyone, welcome. Nice to see everyone. My name's Nicole Preisel, and I'm going to be moderating today. So if you have any questions, definitely message me in the chat. I just want to begin by acknowledging that the Wild Bird Trust is located on the traditional, the ancestral, and the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh people. And they have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. That means since before we can remember, before we have memories, it's been that long. And here at Wild Bird Trust, we are committed to strengthening that relationship with Tsleil-Waututh Nation and striving towards reconciliation and redress. So I raise my hands. I'm Stalo, First Nation, and from Lacamel. And so I raise my hands, and thank you guys so much for being here. So I'm going to be passing it off to Marisa Bischoff, and she will take it from here. Thank you, Marisa.
Thank you, Nicole. It's really great to have a reminder of that for everything we do, just so it's always fresh in our minds. Here. So I'm just gonna say what we're gonna be going over today first. So to begin with, we'll be looking at some of the terminology to describe some of this topic of invasive species. And then we'll go over, why do people try to get rid of invasive species? What's wrong with having invasive species or plants in our green spaces? And then after that, Chloe Hartley is going to be talking about what she worked on for her master's thesis, which focused on Maplewood Flats. So, right, what does it all mean? We have all these species we see in the literature and articles, and when people talk about plants, a lot of these terms are interchanged, and some of them might mean the same thing. So we're just kind of try and examine that first. Like, for example, this picture on the right is also my background picture today, is some common foxglove. It's actually an introduced species to BC, and I think also Canada, but it's not classified as invasive in BC. It is classified as abundant, but it's not a concern here. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture actually defined this plant as invasive, but not here, interestingly enough. So native species, as defined by the Society for Ecological Restoration, is a taxa considered to have their origins in a given region or that have arrived there without recent direct or indirect transport by humans. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but even then, the definition of native species is also one that's pretty much constantly in debate among scientists. So it kind of adds another layer of, complications of understanding these terms, is that not everybody agrees on what they mean exactly. But for simplicity's sake, we'll define a native species as a species that's established within an ecosystem that's evolved there over thousands of years and is adapted to the local conditions of that ecosystem and has co-evolved with other organisms like other species, the same trophic level, predators, diseases, and also the climate, right? So, and how about non-native species, but also alien species or exotic species or introduced species? A lot of these terms are used interchangeably. Again, for simplicity's sake, we'll say there are species that live outside of its native range and is introduced either intentionally or accidentally, usually by humans, from geographically distant locations. And they can be desirable or undesirable. So a naturalized species, naturalized is something that's also used quite often, and a term that's used quite often. And a naturalized species is one that's non-native, but introduced to a wild area and successfully establishes a population, and that population persists over time without help from people. To the right here, this is a common plantain or frogleaf plantain. And this was actually introduced to North America a couple hundred years ago. And so I learned this summer from our summer staff member, Sinakla Wiss, who's an ethnobotanist, that Indigenous people have actually used the common plantain or the frogleaf plantain since its introduction as for many medicinal uses. So even though it's not technically, native, it didn't evolve over here, it's been naturalized, and it still has it's become naturalized to this environment. And then invasive species could be is a non-native, first of all, and it's a species that's able to establish on many sites, grow quickly, and spread to the point of disrupting plant and communities or ecosystems. So why are we concerned with invasive species? So what makes this a non-native species invasive, in other words? So some of these characteristics include that they're efficient and very productive reproducers, meaning they have either a large seed production rate. They can reproduce vegetatively, either through pieces of stem or roots very easily. They could be self-fertile, or like hermaphroditic. So they have usually very effective strategies for reproduction. And because of that, they spread very easily and effectively. And this is related to also dispersal methods. And like, for example, related to this is, say, like blackberries, birds eat the blackberries, of course, and the seeds are within the blackberry berries. And then, of course, the poop of the birds, just is very effective dispersal for these seeds. And then that's how they spread so easily within green spaces. So even if we have a small patch, it can easily spread it to other areas. That's why we also want to take responsibility of trying to manage these sites so they don't spread other places. Another characteristic of invasive species is that they can grow rapidly under many conditions and can be highly tolerant physiologically. So they can grow through extreme conditions like temperature, water quality, high salinity, etc. A lot of invasive species are known to colonize disturbed areas. So that's one of the characteristics of an invasive species. And yeah, they can also be very tough and grow through concrete and survive fires. And their seeds can float through water and establish downstream on banks. That's so common characteristic. And then another last characteristic we'll go over here is that they're usually free of natural predators, at least initially upon invasion. So they don't have any natural predators or grazers, parasites, or diseases found in their native range that would normally, control their population and keep it in equilibrium. So they also decrease biodiversity. And this has been found through many studies over time that they compete with native species for resources. They can alter ecosystem function, like altering flood or fire regimes. They can impact water quality and quantity, can decrease soil productivity, and they can also hybridize with native species, which kind of introduces a whole other problem, or not, as we'll kind of look at later. And a lot of these things could be species specific. Some species might not have these characteristics that I just talked about, or they might not affect the ecosystem in certain ways, but they qualify in other ways. So what does it look like when invasives dominate? Well, they can form dense monocultures such as these, and these two photos are actually taken at Maplewood Flats this morning. And because of these characteristics and the way they grow and their tendency to form monocultures, they can be costly to manage in both effort and money. So if you leave them without management over a long time, it becomes very hard to manage. So spread of invasive species in Canada is estimated to cost in the billions of dollars, and that's not just plants, but animals and plants together. Environment Canada estimates that between 13 to 35 billion dollars are spent annually in the control of just 16 invasive species, and 7.5 billion of those dollars are attributed to damage to the agricultural and forestry industries. So there's a big price tag on controlling these species. So in the UK, I thought it'd be interesting to include this just because I know I'm pretty interested in, the effect of social effect of invasive species. So knotweed has actually been, I guess, identified as the most destructive invasive species in the UK. And 70% of home buyers say they would sue the previous owners if they discovered an infestation of Japanese knotweed. And you're legally required to declare any presence of knotweed on your property in the UK before you can sell it. And if knotweed on your site gets onto on your property, goes onto the property of your neighbors, you're liable to pay for any losses that neighbor's home will have for the selling. So it's pretty crazy in the UK with knotweed. However, in recent years, actually in 2018, one study came out that kind of looked at this issue of the knotweed. And they looked at 3 streets and gave a survey to the residents and collected many records from contractors and surveyors of knotweed in the UK, and then also did an extensive literature search. But keep in mind, this is only just one study. But they found that knotweed actually isn't as destructive as it was initially thought, at least not any more destructive than other plants, and not just as likely to, their roots to push through concrete as like a woody tree or woody root would. And that there are still lots of knowledge gaps with knotweed, Japanese knotweed in the UK, and to be honest here too. And there's a need for a lot more research. And they actually think that because even though Japanese knotweed has been present in the UK for many decades, awareness has increased recently in recent years, which has caused like this big like panic and alarm, especially exacerbated by media. So they think it might not be as bad as like originally thought to have knotweed, and at least the destructive quality of knotweed. So how are invasive plants managed and controlled? So first and foremost, the best way to control and manage is early detection and prevention. And that kind of starts with, public education and being able to recognize some of these species, which is, part of what we're doing right now. So it's great. And so one of the main techniques, and the first technique you'll try to get rid of an invasive species, is mechanical or physical, either through hand pulling, mowing, brush cutting, or even some people have used this technique of, letting goats just graze in a like a penned off area, and then it can be pretty effective, especially if it's done in rotations and done consistently. The problem with mechanical or manual, control methods, it takes a lot of labor intensive, and requires multiple treatments over time to exhaust the plants. The second method is very controversial, a chemical herbicide method to get rid of plants. Obviously herbicides, they can have to be applied, it can only be applied under certain conditions. You can't really apply herbicides within riparian areas. One thing I wanted to show everybody here is that there was this analysis from the State of the World's Plants in 2017 about where and how many studies of control methods are being done. So it looks like here that the most studies being done are in the United States, and even Canada. Like, look how few studies we have here. But another fact here is that 44% of the studies examine chemical methods. So this kind of goes to show the knowledge gaps we still have in, control methods. So there's still lots for everybody to learn, and I'm certainly not an expert. One thing to note about, chemical controlled methods, glyphosate is the biggest, chemical used in, herbicide or chemical control. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, if you didn't know that. There was a study in 2019, 2018 that came out that did a big meta-analysis on the effects of glyphosate, and it found that cancer risk, I think non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, increased by 41% after high exposure to glyphosate. So, and actually, this just came out in 2020 that Roundup, Bayer, who purchased the company Monsanto, you might recognize Monsanto, who owned the kind of Roundup brand. So Roundup is dedicated to pay now $10 billion to settle cancer suits. So even if, and then, however, it's kind of funny. So Bayer they'll pay this $10 billion settlement for the cancer suits, but they still won't put a warning label on Roundup. They just will pay this $10 billion, which I find insane. But yeah, so definitely chemical and herbicides, control is very hotly debated, and the kind of like the last measure to use. And some other novel methods, like this is the benthic barrier method. It kind of excludes sunlight from the photosynthetic parts of the plant. This is not a method that's been used for it's been around. But here, this is a photo from a yellow flag iris eradication workshop that we did over the summer. And this is a novel method for yellow flag iris developed by Dr. Catherine Tarasoff. And then another new method that's been around for a few years now is this thing called stem injections. So basically, instead of spraying herbicide onto like the plant leaves, they're actually injecting the herbicide right into the stem or the root of the plant or the rhizome of the plant. So it's much more localized and much less likely to spread to other plants. And there was one claim on this website, there I found this photograph of the stem injection that said, if you had 13 stems of knotweed and injected 10 stems of the knotweed with the stem injection, the 3 remaining stems would survive because you didn't inject it with the herbicide. So the claim is that it's very targeted. So, but who knows? It's fairly new. So one thing I wanted to note before kind of handing over to Chloe is that, just making the note that invasive plants, they're not inherently bad. They're doing their thing. They're existing how they're supposed to be. And they only got to where they are because of human intervention. And kind of to bring this back away from, this whole, colonial rhetoric or Western science rhetoric of, invasives are bad. Although it's actually been determined that invasive species are one of the biggest threats to biodiversity worldwide. But there's an interesting, way to look at this is that, plants have their own, sovereignty. And this one quote from an article I want to read to you is from Nicholas Rio. He says, I have been told by some Anishinaabe collaborators that every plant and animal is useful to us in some way or multiple ways. And it is our responsibility to figure out how they are useful. So exploring unique ways to deal with invasive species, like using them for alternate fuel sources or incorporating them into our food systems or using them for compost enhancements or medicinal uses or more, is really kind of a really, alternative way to kind of think about invasive species. So, like for example, the frogleaf plantain, which is the leaves that are in Maddie's hand here. They've been found, they were naturalized, like I said earlier, but now they've been used by Indigenous folks here for, you know, hundreds of years for their medicinal uses. And so we really need to find this way to bridge, you know, TIK or TEK, so traditional Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge and Western science together to kind of, you know, find unique ways to manage invasive species on a, you know, site by site basis. So it's really a local place-based way. So I'm just going to hand it over to Chloe Hartley, and she's going to talk about what she studied for her master's thesis and what she found. So I'm going to stop sharing, then you're going to start sharing, Chloe.
Oops. All right. Let me just extend my. There. All right. Are you guys seeing the first slide of my slideshow there?
Yep, it's great. Thank you.
Yep, I can see it.
You always want to, just can't resist wanting to check that there's somebody out there after you go into screen sharing. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk tonight. It's nice to get to revisit the work I did at the conservation area 3 years ago or so now. So I was doing my master's in ecological restoration at a joint program through BCIT and SFU, and I looked at the effect of 2 invasive species, Rubus armeniacus, which is Himalayan Blackberry, and Heterohelix, which is English ivy, on the plant and associated avian community at Maplewood Flats Conservation Area. My presentation will just follow this kind of classic academic paper outline. So as Marisa was mentioning, invasive species are a really important factor in the loss of biodiversity around the world. A large body of research has identified that invasive species are a key factor in this loss of biodiversity. And as Marisa mentioned, I think maybe I don't need to say this, invasive species are plants whose introduction outside of their natural distribution threatens biological diversity. And biodiversity is considered a key indicator for ecosystem efficiency, stability, and resiliency. So the more biodiverse a community is, the more it's considered capable of resilience, which is that capacity of that ecosystem to respond to a disturbance and then resist that damage or recover quickly and go back to its previous state. So at Maplewood Flats, there's a lot of different invasive species, but blackberry and ivy are very prevalent. And there's very little research on the effect of these 2 species on diversity. We see them everywhere. They're classified as invasive species, but there's almost no actual, there's very little research that has been done. So the purpose of my research was to threefold. One, to just collect a baseline survey of all the plants on site, the distribution and abundance, what kind of species are there, and then to use those results to identify potential effects of the target species on plant diversity and on bird use. And then to use these results to contribute to designing restoration response along with Tsleil-Waututh Nation. At the Wild Bird Trust, there is managers have expressed concern with removing invasive species. As Marisa pointed out earlier, they are used by birds and animals for cover, for food, for maybe nesting resources. But we also know they have this effect on diversity. So I was hoping that this research would help address these gaps that we have on site. I'm not sure who everyone in the audience is, so just to locate us, again, we are on the traditional unceded territory of Tsleil-Waututh Nation, whose territory, they're actually, reserve land is here, but they really encompass, their core territory is in and around Burrard Inlet and Howe Sound, down to the Fraser River and beyond. And Maplewood Flats is located right in the heart of that territory. Historically, Maplewood Flats was part of a beautiful, extensive mudflat and marsh complex that stretched from where Maplewood Flats is, all the way almost to the Lionsgate Bridge, from all the different creeks that come, Lynn Creek, Seymour River, Mosquito Creek, McKay Creek. Of course, those are their settler names, but this marsh extended across that entire extent. And now you can see here's an image from 2016 that the waterfront has now been filled and is very heavy industrial transformation of the landscape. And even the Maplewood Flats area, this feature here is a barge channel. You guys can see my cursor, right? Is that right? No, okay, never mind. In the red square, you can see like a vertical line there. That's a channel that was carved out of the landscape for that white patch up above is a gravel quarry. And so that barge channel exists today. That's the little bridge you cross over when you're at Maplewood Flats. And you can see that the landscape on the left-hand side is very, there's like square edges to the conservation area. And that's because this was actually filled. This image shows the fill site from the Vancouver Port Authority back in the day of just creating, this is called land reclamation, where you're sort of creating land, so to speak, industrial land out of marshland. And you can see it's gone from sort of what I imagine is very compact bare earth on the left to sort of a meadow on the right, probably kind of weedy. And then on the left, sorry, I've got my directions wrong here. No, that's right. And on the right, it's a sort of now forested landscape, mostly forested landscape. Okay, so that's just the context for the study. And the methods I used, I did 17 baseline transects across the site. I measured the species that were there, the percent cover of each of those species in 67 10 by 10 sample quadrats. For the bird survey, that's the rectangle, or rectangle on the right. You can see those little numbers. Those are all the bird survey stations. I had these 12 sample sites, and I did 13 dawn surveys with 4-minute observation intervals. I did a fixed radius point count bird survey. So that's the 2 data collections I did for my master's. And then for statistical analysis, I did very general summary statistics using RStudio. And then for the bird survey, I used an analysis called principal component analysis. And so what I did is I assigned landscape attributes to each of those sample sites from 1 to 12, whether it was in the open or in the forest or on the edge, how much plant diversity was there, the percent cover of blackberry and percent cover of ivy. And then I ran that data with the bird sightings through the principal component analysis. So the results for the plant survey, you can see here the yellow denotes ivy and the red is where I found blackberry. And then where it's orange is where the 2 plants are overlapping. You can see there's a really distinct pattern on site between the red blobs and the yellow blobs. And what's different about this is this eastern part of the conservation area is actually owned by the District of North Vancouver. And this part of the landscape was it was logged, but it was never bulldozed or filled or covered. And there's a lot of the original indigenous plant species on this landscape. And that landscape has not been colonized by the blackberry, but it does have very extensive ivy. These blue circles are just where the marsh landscape is. And then on the fill site that's owned by the port, I found blackberry on 95% of my sample sites in there. So just to hone in on the results a little bit, this is kind of a lot of numbers here, but I have 3 columns here. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority property, that's that section in the center. The District of North Vancouver eastern portion, that's the less disturbed site. And then I also did a couple reference transects in a nearby forest that wasn't filled and was less disturbed than the other 2 sites. And what I found is that on the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority side, the more disturbed site, you can see that the indigenous species diversity is lower at 6.1, and the indigenous shrub species is just under 2. That's the average number of species that were in each of my sample quadrats. relative to the District of North Van and the reference site. And you can see actually there, the DNV East actually had greater diversity than the reference site, but they're pretty close to each other. And then when you're looking at Indigenous shrub cover, again, you see some really stark differences between the two sites. So the port side had just 20% average Indigenous shrub cover relative to the DNV East side that had 48% Indigenous shrub cover, but the reference site had 85% shrub cover. So you can see that there's this, when the sites that have the blackberry and the ivy have quite a bit less cover. And one subtle kind of difference here to think about also, birds really like structure. They really like to have cover in their landscape. And if you consider that blackberry does provide some structure, but you think of ivy as just like flat along the ground, it doesn't provide a lot of structure. So if you want to just compare percent cover of the different parts of the site, the Port Authority, if you add 20% plus 51% cover, you've got 71% cover. But for the DNV East, if you add those two numbers, you're under 60% shrub cover relative to the reference site where you have, like 90% shrub cover here. So ivy, I'll come to the results further. I'll do some more discussion of those results later. Anyway, those are the key results of my plant survey. So then I did my bird survey. That was really fun. I went out at dawn with a really wonderful birder who taught me all the bird calls, because initially I didn't know them, and he helped me with every survey with recording the birds. In total, there was 1,400 bird observations over the season, approximately 10 birds recorded per site per visit. So the analysis that I did is kind of a mouthful explaining it. It's a principal component analysis. It allows the most important relationships between numerous different species and multiple variables to be observed. So principal component 1, which is these yellow circles, explains the greatest proportion of the variance, and then principal component 2 is the next greatest proportion of variables, which is kind of hard to explain, but it's basically you're wanting to show the relationships between all of these things together. And what the PCA analysis is used here to do is to identify the patterns of bird presence associated with those different landscape attributes that I talked to you about. And what you see here is these are all the bird species, and you can see also they have lines coming from the center point showing the direction they're moving away from. Basically, they have very strong negative association with a large group of landscape attributes, which is the blackberry and the ivy cover. They're mostly associated, if you look where those bird blue lines are, with the landscape attribute of high plant diversity. Oops, key findings. So in short, what I found was that plant diversity decreases as invasive species cover increased. And the PCA results for bird presence showed a negative association with blackberry and ivy, and a positive association with high plant diversity. And I have these 3 illustrations here. I think they're pretty illustrative of the difference. So on the first picture shows high diversity and high cover. So this is a pretty mostly native plant species in here. This is on all 3 of these are on Maplewood Flats. So the first one has sword fern, trailing blackberry, vine maple, salmonberry, alder, twinberry, Indian plum. The next one, you see blackberry. You've got lots of cover, but very low diversity. And also you notice that cover is very homogeneous. It's all like 1.5 meters high. And all you see there is blackberry and alder. And way in the back, I think there's a faint bit of green. That might be holly in the back. And then the third picture is showing ivy. And this patch actually does have some sword fern. There's a little sword fern by the tree there, and there's some twigs of salmonberry and little bit sprouts of Indian plum. But you can see it appears to be quite open. So different invasive species can have very different effects on the landscape. And what I observed is this, and what the results indicated is that the the ivy has less of an effect on diversity as it does on that cover and complexity, whereas the blackberry seem to have quite a much stronger effect on diversity. I also did a sort of review of literature on these species, and the summary that I found from there, findings from there, is that, again, ivy has an effect on diversity and percent shrub cover. There's no data on wildlife use there. Blackberry, R. armeniacus, is used by birds for nesting, but it is not preferred to indigenous plant species. So when indigenous species are not present, blackberry is used by birds and small mammals. And in a very disturbed landscape, that might be the only habitat they have, the only food and cover that they might have. But when indigenous species are present, that's where you'll find the birds and the wildlife. So the birds and wildlife tend to prefer being within the indigenous species. And then also findings that birds really thrive where there's high indigenous species diversity and complex structure and cover. So the implications for ecological restoration for the site, for managing the site, is, this work helps to build the evidence of the effects of blackberry and ivy on plant diversity in British Columbia. Because as I said, I think there are probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 papers in total on ivy that I could find, and maybe 3 times as many on blackberry. So, and then very few actually took place in BC. So this really helps to build the knowledge in BC. And my conclusions from the research is that the Maplewood Flats Conservation Area could be a lot more valuable for birds if we restored indigenous plant diversity and cover, and if we managed those invasive species. As I said, I found blackberry in 95% of my sample sites. Also, we should do more research, and also the restoration prescription. So choosing which plants and what sort of relative abundance you want restored to the site. Wild Bird Trust is working with Tsleil-Waututh, and one of the projects they're working on is inching towards having this restoration prescription being directed by Tsleil-Waututh Nation. So that's it. That's the end of my master's thesis from 3 years ago. Any questions? And I'll stop screen sharing now. There we go.
Thank you. I have we have some species, if we want to kind of talk about some of the characteristics of some of these invasive species we find at Maplewood Flats. Would you mind going over that while people think on some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first one is the Himalayan Blackberry. I know you just talked about it, but is there anything you want to add in terms of how the blackberry affects, the landscape and, how it kind of chokes out? Does it choke out other plants, and how does that do it?
Yeah, one thing I found with when there were dense blackberry patches, the only other plant growing within them would be moss, essentially. So it's very hard they are very good colonizers on disturbed soil. And if they get in there and start off and become the predominant plant species, that I think it's the shade and the structure that they're producing really inhibits new plants from becoming established on site. And that's a lot of what has happened, I think, at the conservation area. Mm-hmm. Another thing to think about is that blackberry, we have a lot of similar species in British Columbia. We have salmonberry, we have trailing blackberry, we have roses. They're sort of similar niche spaces. Yeah, there's beautiful native trailing blackberry. So some insects that feast are host to these other species may find Himalayan blackberry an analogous plant, and that might be helpful for birds and small mammals for foraging. But again, when you are the predominant plant on site, that means that the only flowers in that forest are blackberries in June, and then the only fruit in that forest is blackberries in August. Whereas a more mixed diversity will have a succession of flowers throughout the season for insects, for pollinators, and a succession of fruit, and then all the range of insects that are specific or general to all of those species.
I found that so interesting when you first told me that, because I never thought about it like that before, that, the phenology of, different fruit emerging at different times during the season. Never thought about that, but so interesting. I just wanted to draw attention to the picture on the right. I took this, I think like a month and a half ago, but where that arrow is pointing is actually a tree sapling that was planted last March or February. So you can see how
Oh my
much, not
gosh.
even a year of growth has just overtaken it, right? So it was totally swallowed up by this blackberry, and we did cut it free. Let me reassure you.
That's
So,
another one of the traits of blackberries. They put out an initial cane in the beginning of the season, and then they have like another growth spurt. So they, like our native roses, the Nootka rose sends out a great big tall cane, but this blackberry can then send another one on top of it and drag it down, just like this. What happened to this sapling?
yeah.
Sad. It's very sad.
Yeah, it's
Free
pretty
the
crazy
trees.
plants. They're very hardy, like those characteristics we went over. Their strategy is just so tough. And
Yeah.
if the tip of the first year growth goes back into the ground, it can grow again from that. It can root from that. So it's pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so yeah, so when you're managing invasive species, if you're not wanting to spray them and you're going to dig them out, but you know that there's some roots left or there's some seed bank left, you want to think about what are the traits of that blackberry, and what plants could you plant that would compete with them? So I would plant like other, very shade heavy plants that would prevent the blackberry seeds from germinating, and then maybe fast growing plants that can rise above the blackberry, and shade tolerant plants as well. So look for what are those characteristics of that invasive species, and then how can you kind of beat them at their own game?
Mm-hmm. Cool. How about English ivy?
Did you have a comment, Nicole?
No, go ahead and I'll ask it at the end.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Ivy is interesting. You mostly see it along the forest floor, but you see how it's going up in the trees in the second picture there. An interesting thing about ivy is it changes form and structure once it starts going vertically. And if you are walking around and looking at ivy in a forest, when you see it on the forest floor, you'll see they're quite deeply lobed leaves. But when they start growing vertically, the leaf form actually changes and becomes much rounder and less lobed. And it starts getting woodier, and it actually starts growing branches, basically, out from the trunk of the tree, as you can see there. And that's when it can flower. So it basically almost never will grow flowers and fruit on the forest floor. But once it starts going up trees, that enables it to change into this other form and start fruiting and flowering. So a minimum management technique would be just to prevent it from climbing the trees, and then at least it's not spreading. Mm-hmm. Although another consideration is that birds do eat the berries, and the flowers are very attractive to bees.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost an easy way to stop the spread, though. They do spread vegetatively, but having such a large source, for invasive species, it's kind of, we have to kind of take a little bit of responsibility for stopping the spread to, like adjacent, sites. But I just find the fact that they change their, morphology when they grow vertically. I never knew that either. It's very cool.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
How about the yellow flag iris?
All right. Yellow flag iris is, not native to North America. It's a really pretty flower. A lot of people have it in their gardens. A cousin of mine actually transplanted it from her home in Creston to Vancouver Island. What? There's a lot of other irises you could pick. But anyway, what interesting thing that yellow flag iris does is that you can see in this picture, it forms these very extensive patches. So again, it displaces native species. So there's just less diversity in that area. But also if you imagine a pond or a natural wetland, they often have gently sloping sides to your natural pond. You have the edge of your pond is a gentle slope. And what happens with yellow flag iris is it will grow out into the water and fill in the area of this gentle slope. And then it makes sort of a drop off at whatever it is, a foot or 2 feet. So the very edge of the pond, that interface gets completely transformed from this, pond edge to a very abrupt cutoff. And so if you're a little insect that would normally be in that area, or you're a little songbird that might go down and eat insects from that area, or you're a little duck that's maybe not a fabulous diving duck, you have lost that entire band of habitat, of foraging landscape. And so all of a sudden ducks have to dive deeper to muck about in and access insects in the pond. So that's one of the, like, how it sort of transforms the, or interrupts a function of the wetland.
And I like that. Could you do you think you could classify that as like an ecosystem engineer?
Well, I don't want to give it all that credit, but yeah, it's, I mean, it's definitely in changing the structure.
Yeah, alters. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and
that title just goes to beavers.
I know, love beavers.
Oh yeah, and this is a work, you were at that workshop, right, Marissa, last year?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the benthic barrier is more effective on some plants and less effective on others, but it's very effective on the yellow flag iris because their response to being covered and being deprived of light and oxygen is to grow as fast as they can to try and sort of overcome this barrier. And they end up expending, or basically creating, a sort of chemical reaction inside their own, the root system, the corms, that poisons themselves. It's very dramatic death that they have, but this is very effective. Whereas it can be less effective, say, on grasses. When grasses are covered, think of grasses when they get covered with snow, they just go dormant. If they get stressed, they go dormant. And so it takes a lot longer to have an effect on other species. So again, you really have to do some research into the biology of your invasive species when you're looking at how to manage it.
Mm-hmm. Another thank you to Dr. Catherine Tarasoff. She's been developing this method over, I don't know, something like 8 years, something like that. Yeah, thank you. We'll be probably having another workshop this year. Hopefully that works out with funding. And then how about reed canary grass, Chloe? What can you tell us?
It's terrible. No, it's similar thing to the yellow flag iris with wetlands. It also can fill in that edge habitat, that little ecotone between the pond and the upland. Mm-hmm. And as you can see here, it really grows rapidly and forms these very extensive meadows of just this one plant. It also is eaten by bears in the early spring because it can be high in protein and sugars, but it also displaces native species. And it's only recently arrived at the Maplewood Flats Conservation Area, and we're just in the process of developing a management plan for these on site. Do you have more you would say about reed canary grass, Marisa?
I worked for a summer with Ducks Unlimited Canada, and the reed canary grass, we had brush cutters. So that photo earlier on of the brush cutter in front of all that reed canary grass and blackberry, that was me with the brush cutter. And I would say reed canary grass it's easy to cut, but when it goes dormant and it kind of dies over the winter, and then new stalks grow over the summer. So the dormant or the dead grass kind of layers and it forms these large mats underneath, and it's so much biomass, and it just kind of piles up, and it's very hard to get rid of. So that's my personal experience with reed canary grass, but I think I'm also very allergic to it.
Oh no!
When it infloresces.
It is a very beautiful grass. It's very tall and very pretty, but not for here.
Narrowleaf cattail, lots to say.
Yes, we could go on a lot about narrowleaf cattail, also non-native. It's actually very, very similar to those two other plants. It is used by birds they nest in it, but what the issue with narrowleaf cattail is that it fills in open water much more than our native cattail. So restoration sites in the Lower Mainland where people have created habitat for salmon or open water for overwintering or migrating birds, very quickly, if Narrowleaf Cattail arrives, it will just fill in that water, and then you just lose that landscape. You no longer have an open water pond. You no longer have a channel for your salmon to adapt to the intertidal habitat. Yeah.
And we have the native cattail species is the broadleaf cattail. The problem with the narrowleaf, it actually hybridizes with the native species, so that causes even further confusion or lack of knowledge in how to manage that or even identify it. Sometimes you even have to get a genetic DNA analysis to identify which is which, and because it has so much morphological phenotypic diversity. Yeah, so anything else to say about this one?
Yeah, just I guess the hybrid is taller and denser and faster and bigger and better of the two of them. Yeah, same thing. It's creating
takes the best qualities of both.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's all. There are other non-native species on the flats, but I figure we would just go over a few key ones. So
yeah,
thank you everybody for listening to us and showing interest in this topic. It's I think really important to just be aware of some of these things, especially when we're planting our own species, like plants in our backyard. And yeah, so I'll throw it over to Nicole to see if there's anything in the chat for questions, or if you want to ask any questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, definitely unmute yourself or write in the chat, and we'd love to answer that. But I love this presentation. It was amazing. And Marisa, I love when you were talking about, the difference between, naturalized invasive plants, or like they used to be that, and because like frogleaf, plantain is what it was the first plant that my grandma taught me about, and I always
so sweet.
Yeah, I always keep that so like dear to my heart. And then I remember someone being like, well, it's an invasive, blah 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 blah, and I was trying to explain to them that yes, okay, it once was an invasive and it has spread. I know that there's a nickname called settler's footprint that some people call it because it kind of just spread, right? But at the same time, it does have such meaning to many different indigenous nations across Turtle Island, and it has helped my grandma personally for like many things, and many other people. So yeah, I don't know, I just found that really interesting. And yeah, I think it's really good that we talk about this, because I think, Chloe, like you're mentioning, it's okay to have some, but when it starts to spread and starts to choke out other plants, that's when it becomes that issue, and I think blackberry is such a good example of that. It's like, it can just really take over huge swaths of land, and it's really hard to get rid of.
Yeah, no, I think there needs to be a balance struck between, like I was mentioning, and like you're saying, like having, traditional indigenous knowledge with, quote unquote Western science. I mean, it's not, what like broadly talked about in the field, the fact that we have so much to learn as settlers from indigenous knowledge. And it's kind of, I feel like it's a lost opportunity to, develop, management techniques, or, how to deal with it. So yeah,
definitely
valuable conversation.
One thing I would add too with that like labeling, that label of invasive species too, is a lot of the plants have been labeled invasive in the context of agriculture. So they're pests for, if you're a cattle farmer, weeds. And so a lot of plants that we have, especially on our roadsides, like disturbed sites, they're not necessarily invading and displacing huge indigenous landscapes, but they are a problem on farms. So that's one of the reasons why that label is on there. And and I think there are native plantains. Like we have one in the because there's one in the wetland.
Yeah, there's two different types. There's like a long, or there might be other ones, but the ones I know, it's a long leaf and then like a more round leaf. And yeah, they have great medicinal qualities, and I think that when you do see them, you don't see them interfering with other plants, I mean, for the most part.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And like so many non-native species, like they have established here, but they don't, they don't take on those invasive qualities. So and sometimes it might be good to have, that redundancy maybe in the types of species we have, and just in case something happens, or
Even in your background picture, Marisa, like you have foxglove and buttercup and some grasses, and there's a million different wildflowers there that I think are European in the background there, but they do serve, they are functioning in there, and they're good for pollinators, and they're providing cover, and they have seeds. And so it's not, nothing in science is black, like nothing is black and white. It's all about and about preponderance of evidence, and in different situations, and all these qualifiers, and that's just something to always consider in your
and it's like also, like you said, case by case basis, site specific, also depends on the values of the people or who are looking at it. There's one other thing I was gonna say, but I forgot.
I was gonna say really quickly that for anyone watching this, there's many things you can do with invasive plants instead of just tossing them in the waste bin. And I spent a lot of years with like a local organization pruning blackberry bushes, and then using the stems to you take the outer layer off, and when it dries, it looks very similar to cedar, and so does the iris leaves, and you can use that. And I think and ivy you can also weave with. So if you're into arts or making of any sort, definitely explore that, because you can create things with these plants, and it doesn't have to just go to the waste. And I think that that's kind of a nice way. I was part of a project where we used English ivy, and we got them and dried them and all of that kind of stuff, and we wove little plant baskets, and then we planted indigenous wildflowers. So I thought that was
like such a great example of like how to, another way of how to, not like to live with these species, because if we're being realistic, there's no way we're going to totally eradicate a lot of these like what we're calling invasive species, because they have a hold, so a quote unquote hold on, the region, like they're here to stay. When we talk about, like control or management, it's exactly that. Like we just have to prioritize areas that, maybe they're monoculture, like a few areas in Maple Flats that could use some, diversity, but there's no way we're going to totally get rid of some of these species. And it's just learning to recognize that and how to use them in effective, productive ways, I think.
Totally. Yeah. If you spent like every spring weeding your ivy so it doesn't grow so much, and or when is the best time to weed it, and then using that to make some baskets, it's like, there you go, you're at least doing your part where you live. And I think that's what we can all do is, hey, is there a plant around me that I can possibly go and use it or prune it or whatever it might be, so it just doesn't start overtaking so much space.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about maintenance. So I think, unless anybody else wants to add anything, I think that was a really great conversation. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you,
Erica. Did you?
Yeah,
Erica, did you?
I did just want to throw in another thing there, which is,
awesome.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's super interesting. I really appreciate it. In pandemic times, I've gotten very interested in invasive species, so it's lovely. But you were talking a little bit about sort of uses for plants, and I've become really interested in English ivy and removing it in sort of the areas around where I live, where it's gradually taking over. In a while, I feel like it will cover the whole woods near my house, which is real sad. But one of the other really interesting things you can do with English ivy is English ivy contains saponins, which are soap-like things. I am not a biochemist. Can't speak to that front.
I don't think any of us are. It's okay.
Applauds to anyone who is. Holy smokes, it's so complicated. Um, but English ivy, the leaves of English ivy have this really interesting property where they can foam up and you can use them as like a laundry detergent.
Oh.
So you can use them for cleaning because the saponins in them will help dissolve emulsify and dissolve oils in water.
Fascinating.
So you can use them as laundry detergents, which is really interesting. And then it also does have some really interesting medicinal properties that I do not know enough to speak about. But so you actually see it in, for some reason, in Europe where it's more native, you'll see a whole lot of people sell like English ivy extracts for a whole bunch of things, mainly as like bronchitis treatments. And it's actually like there's actually some scientific studies. Some of them aren't that great. Some of them are pretty good, like double blind. Some of them are like a little more like, it seems to work. But so I just think it's really interesting that English ivy is this both sort of very, very invasive plant that I'm like, I want to get rid of it. But also we were talking a little bit about sort of uses for English ivy and uses for invasive plants.
Totally.
And it has all of these really interesting properties and I don't know, I'm just very excited about it. I think it's very cool.
I love it.
Like even knotweed, how destructive it can be. Actually, in Japan, they eat the young shoots, so that's
they taste
actually
really good, actually. Careful here because they do spray. So unless you're 100% sure they have not sprayed, do not go because you have to be careful there. But in places they haven't sprayed, in places they haven't sprayed, I definitely suggest getting some because they taste. I just tasted some with my dad this past spring, and they're actually really good.
Cool.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you're in the Lower Mainland, I would probably recommend against, trying this because I hate to say it, but like that's the main technique they've used to try and get rid of, knotweed is herbicides. So I would probably not, but
sometimes they have signs, but you don't trust it. You just never know, right?
And,
so always be careful.
Right. I mean, it's so interesting. I just want to say because like there's this whole realm of knowledge of how to use plants, but that's been lost, especially with settlers. There's this whole I don't know, this saying or concept of plant blindness within the general population, because as we've grown farther and farther away from living with the land, we lose a lot of that that knowledge or the need to know that. So I think it's really interesting, and I hope maybe some way we can give back to working collaborating with the land.
Nice.
This is a great conversation. Nice. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Chloe. This has been fantastic. I feel so lucky to have this as a job because I just get to listen to amazing people speak and share their amazing wisdom. So I raise my hands to both of you just for your time, your energy, your wisdom, your knowledge, and I really appreciate it. And to the people watching, thank you so much. And I can't remember, was it Erica that you were the one who shared? But so thank you as well for that, because it's nice to have these spaces of knowledge sharing, right? And and learning together, and so I appreciate it. And for everyone watching at home, thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, just write to us at communications@wildbirdtrust.org.
Thank you, Nicole. You're amazing.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Marisa. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks for that, you guys. It was fantastic.
Great. Thanks, Jamie.
Learned so much.
Awesome.
All right. Bye.